Hello, everyone, and welcome to this NAVSKILL webinars. My name is Mark Brummel. I will be doing this webinar together with Michael Nielsen today, and Jan Silliman is with us as a moderator. Before we start, we have the typical housekeeping rules that we have before all of our webinars. As you know, all of our webinars are recorded. You can find them on YouTube. This is the link to our YouTube channel. If you are on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. It is important for YouTube to have that. We typically announce our new webinars on the NAVSKILLS website, even though Luc is more disciplined in that than I am, or we send out newsletters, and in the newsletters we also announce the webinars. If you have any questions, please use the GoToWebinar question window. As you may hear in my voice, or not, but I am a little bit more nervous than I am typically for these webinars, which is because we had an all-time record of people signing up for this one. We passed the 500 subscribers number by far. So I think we will have 200 to 300 people in the webinar. So I'm not jealous at Jan being the moderator. If all of you guys start asking questions, then you'll have a hard time deduplicating everything and keeping track of all the questions. So this is normally where we thank ForNAV of being a sponsor for the webinars. But today we have kind of a special webinar because this is actually a joint webinar between NAVSKILLS and ForNAV. We will look today at converting Seaside to AL, and we will compare using the standard Microsoft tooling and using the tooling that Michael Nielsen created with ForNAV. Let's look at the agenda that we have for today. First, we will start with a brief introduction. We will repeat a little bit around extensions and how to execute the conversion process. And then we will look at two typical business cases for converting code. And we will see, hopefully, that converting code is not just a technical exercise, but it includes teamwork, procedures, and also making a lot of business decisions. Then we will do a brief demo, but because we want to keep a lot of time for questions and sharing tips, tricks, and pitfalls, that'll probably be a short demo, and we also have a couple of YouTube videos that show this process. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, and Jan will keep an eye on questions. If Jan has the feeling that it's important to stop me and to ask a question in between, he will do that. But we will try to keep the questions as much as possible to the end because of deduplicating questions and stuff like that. So I wanted to start today's presentations where I left off at NAV Tech Days. At NAV Tech Days, I did a session like this together with Pike, and I ended the session with what if. For most developers in our ecosystem, extensions and AL is a synonym for moving to Visual Studio. And I think this is a wrong exception. Moving from Seaside to Visual Studio is something else than moving from Seaside to extensions and to AL. And what Microsoft did is Microsoft made two changes at the same time. Microsoft introduced the concept of extensions at the same time, or almost at the same time, as they introduced Visual Studio Code as a new development environment. And I think that this makes the whole process very confusing, or at least confusing enough for developers and even more for non-technical peers in our community. Extensions as a concept is not new. We've actually had extensions in NAV for about a decade with Delta File. And for a long time, Delta files lived outside of Seaside, their own life. And this made the adoption of Delta files very low, because it was kind of an abstract mechanism, and you couldn't really see what was going on, except if you were familiar with the text syntax. To my personal opinion, I think the whole adoption rate and the whole concept would have been different when Seaside would have had 2 buttons. If Seaside would have had 2 buttons with table extensions and page extension, it would have given everyone in our ecosystem more time to get adopted with the idea of not being able to modify the NAV-based source code. And then the migration from Seaside to Visual Studio Code would have been different than the migration from not being able to change Microsoft code and going into decoupled extensions. It would have made the migration process a lot easier for a lot of partners that I have been consulting with. Let's briefly recap some of the differences between Seaside and AL. And I know that this slide is by far not complete, but I wanted to give a helicopter view over this. With extensions, you are not able to make changes in base nav anymore, or at least not yet. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But with AL, you have to make table extensions and page extensions. You have to use event subscribers. And there is no extension story for query, XML port, and reports, other than that you have to replace them with new ones. The menu suite is gone, which actually, my personal opinion is, I think it's a good thing. And the menu suite has been replaced with usage categories, of which I will also come back later in this webinar. And .NET is going to leave us, although this is also in a two-step rocket. If you stay with AL on-prem, you can keep using .NET for now. But if you want to go to AppSource, then you have to switch to native types or use the CL library that Microsoft provides with built-in .NET things. Also, I'll come back to that later in the webinar, but the compiler behaves different. Code that compiles in Seaside may not compile in Visual Studio Code. And also the way that the license is checked is different. And this mainly has an impact on end users that have application builder licenses or solution developer licenses, but it also has an impact on ISVs who want to ship their extensions to end users on premise. So let's look at some challenges that we have with Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a great code editor used throughout the development community for almost every programming language. But from an NAV perspective, we have a couple of performance challenges, although Microsoft is challenging that. I have seen substantial performance improvements between the first versions that came with NAV 18 and the current builds that we receive with Docker. And Microsoft recently announced that they will implement rapid application development in Visual Studio Code, which basically is the same as we have in Seaside. What happens in Seaside if you change an object is that the object that you're changing is converted behind the scenes into C# code. And the rest of the objects in your NAV system is expecting that they don't have to change in order to adapt to that change. And this makes Seaside very fast development environment. And Microsoft has moved that principle into Visual Studio Code now. Personally, finding objects, I think it's still very hard, even though somebody actually made an object designer in Visual Studio Code. I haven't tried that myself yet. Personally, I use the ForNAV modern object designer for this. But finding objects and keeping track of objects, I think, is a lot harder in Visual Studio Code than it is in Seaside. And also schema changes is hard. If you want to change the data type of a field, if you are on-prem, or if you want to make changes to tables, you have to write upgrade code units. But also on that part, there's good news, because Schema changes is improving. With the spring release, it will be possible that if you change the type of a field, just like in Seaside, you can do a for sync, and then if you change from an integer to a decimal, the field will be just made blank. So also that part is picked up by Microsoft. Versioning, I played around and experimented a lot with versioning. There's a couple of blogs in our community that have some tips and tricks around versioning, like including the date that you modified the objects in the version. My personal opinion is don't touch the version unless you have to. As soon as you start changing the version of your extension, you have to start writing upgrade code units, and publishing the extension actually expects you to write upgrade code units. So be very careful with changing the version if you're not shipping your software. Only if you really ship your software and your software ends up being at an end user site, I think then versions should be updated. But don't just update the version with every commit that you do on Git. And as I said, the license checking has changed. When you publish an extension, Microsoft checks if the license which is running on the service tier has insert permissions of a certain object. And if your license does not have insert permissions, you are not allowed to publish the extension unless your extension is a runtime build. And I'll come back to the runtime builds later, but this is a big problem for a lot of end users because runtime extensions do not allow to be debugged. So I think there's a big challenge for Microsoft here to fix that in the future. Keeping track of used object IDs, especially for page and table extensions, is a nightmare, especially if you start breaking up your extension or your solution into multiple sub-extensions. Personally, I keep Excel sheets, which kind of sounds silly, but I keep Excel sheets to keep track of which object ID is used in which extension. Because with Seaside gone, Seaside used to be our Excel sheet, but Seaside is no longer there. So you need to come up with an alternative to find object IDs. Okay, so let's look at two business cases. I'm going to mention two business cases that I've been working on for the last year and a half. And on those two business cases, we have converted or partially converted from Seaside to AL. And these are the two big projects that Michael and I used to test the ForNAV conversion tool. So the steps to convert code is multiple. The first thing that you have to do is you have to upgrade your code to Business Central. Microsoft requires you to export your code from an MS-DOS command using the FinSQL. And that command is only available in Business Central or in NAV 2018. Of course, you can use NAV 2018, but Microsoft is improving the experience all the time. And the improvements are mostly in the Business Central runtime on the Docker builds. And if you really want to have the best conversion experience, you have to upgrade your customer to the Business Central runtime. And this is where it's tricky, because if you want to convert an NAV 2015, 16, or 17 database to an extension, you also have to find your base version and upgrade that to Business Central, because both of the versions have to be exported from the Business Central runtime. Then you have to export all your objects to TXT using export new to new syntax, and I'll come back to how you do that later. But this is basically happening in MS-DOS, in MS-DOS command prompt. And then you have to create the Delta files. So if you were an early adopter of Delta files and you have been working with Delta files from the moment Microsoft made them available, which is a pretty long time ago, then this is very familiar for you. But if you're not familiar with Delta files, this is something that you have to learn. But you cannot use all your Delta files. You can only use the Delta files for tables and for pages. And for code units, reports, and XML ports, you have to delete them. You have to deal with them in another way. And this is something that we try to improve in the ForNAV conversion tool, where instead of deleting the code units, we actually preserve the code units, so you can have a framework for your event subscribers. After the export and the creation of your Delta files, you have to run txt to AL, which is also an MS-DOS command that you have to execute. Then you have to convert your menu suite, which is actually a bit weird. When I read it, I got the feeling that somebody at Microsoft thought, oh, oops, we forgot to handle menu suites. Now we have to do it in a different way, because menu suites are actually dealt with in PowerShell. So all of this other stuff is happening in DOS, and then you have to switch to PowerShell to convert a menu suite. And then you have to deduplicate .NET, and I don't go into details about that right now. I'll show you that when I do the demo. But the .NET is actually handled in quite a special way, where if Microsoft already used something, you don't have to create it yourself, and the tools is still creating it. It's easier to show than to talk about it. So the first end user case that I want to talk to you about is one of my most loyal customers. They have been my customer for about 10 years. And they started with Navision about 20 years ago. Their code base started with Navision Financials 2.60. Because of that, their pages are converted using the page transformation tool. And I have a screenshot where I will show you some weird behavior. If you have a page which is converted from a form using transformation tool, you will run into issues if you convert that page to an extension. Currently, we are on NAV 2018, and our goal eventually is to go completely to Business Central hosted by Microsoft. If you look at Business Central hosted by Microsoft, and you look at it from an end user perspective, it is so insanely attractive to have it hosted by Microsoft, because everything from an end user perspective that comes with dealing with hosting NAV has been vanished. It's simplified. And I think every one of us who has been in our community for more than 10 or 20 years has seen that we went from putting a CD into a server and having Navision running to a very complicated setup with multiple tiers and web clients, and hosting Navision yourself has become very complicated, and having that hosted by Microsoft is really attractive from an end user perspective. Our database has no less than 1,865 customized objects, of which 1,741 are new, added in Seaside. So we have 120 customized base NAV objects, which is not entirely fair, because the first thing we did when we moved to NAV 2018 is we moved all of our page changes to an extension. So all of the changes we did to NAV pages are already in an extension, and the other 120 changes are table changes and some basic changes to code units. The add-on solution we have is retired. The partner who delivered the add-on solution no longer maintains it, and they sold their IP to another partner who we don't have a relationship with. We use Anveo Web Portal and ForNAV as ISV solutions, which is important because if you want to move your database to an extension, all of your dependencies have to also respect that. And on top of that, we have 25 customized DLL files that we use with .NET, and we have a lot of EDI file I/O that we have to convert to streams. So the challenges that we have is that our programming license no longer works. So we have Application Builder, and with Application Builder, we can change almost anything in our ISV solution. We have no dependency on the original partner, but now with extensions, that no longer works, which is not per se bad, because with Business Central, custom objects are now free. So we actually have to renumber the original ISV solution to 50,000 range, and then we can move that to an extension in Business Central. Another challenge that we have is that the web client is not on par with the Windows client. I'll show you a couple of screenshots of pages that we have in the Windows client that will never work in the web client. And we actually solved that with Angular and client add-ins. And I'll show you a couple of screenshots of that as well. Lastly, I'm getting the idea if I go to Yammer and if I go to GitHub and if I talk to partners when you go to events like NAV Tech Days, is Microsoft is not 100% in control of Business Central yet. It seems to take them longer than they expect themselves to roll out fixes. And it doesn't make me feel comfortable right now to move my customer to Business Central. But then again, we probably need more than 12 months to get everything ready. And I fully expect them to get the beast under control by then. But I'm not jealous at the people who are already there and have to deal with translations fading away and stuff like that. So how do we convert our code? If you first convert your code to an extension, please do not expect it to work. It will fail, and I can guarantee you that it fails. The solutions that I've converted, on average, I've seen 1 error per object. Recently, I converted a solution with 8,000 custom objects, and we had 8,000 errors. And that's kind of what you have to expect the first time that you execute it. Some codes need to be rewritten, mostly in cases of .NET, and the compilers are different. You'll see that you run into bugs that you didn't know that were there. But what we did, both at this project, but also with the ForNAV solution, is we convert, then we look at the errors, then we go back to C-side, we fix the errors in C-side, then we reconvert and repeat that process until the C-side code converts into an extension, until you have 100% conversion. So briefly, a couple of compiler differences. This is a case statement. At first glance, nothing is wrong with this case statement. It compiles perfectly fine in C-side, but if you convert it to an extension, the AL compiler will find that you have 2 identical case statements and AL breaks. So worked for 20 years in C-side and it breaks in AL. Here we have a Boolean field that in the previous life was an option field. So we changed an option field to a Boolean field. This is the code that C-side will create, and C-side is fine with this code, but AL doesn't like it. AL says this is a Boolean and you shouldn't treat a Boolean as an option field. If you have made changes to code units like format address and dimension management, you have to rewrite your code because you cannot put code in those code units anymore. But the good news is that most of these fixes can be made in C-side. Instead of changing format address code units, you can make a function in the table for format address. And what we actually did is we actually cloned dimension management partly. And, we've put our own functions in dimension management, and where necessary, we use external functions that are available. This is the example where you have a page that was converted from a form. The page transformation tool was not familiar with the onAfterGetCur record, so the page transformation tool created a function that was called onAfterGetCur record. And after Microsoft introduced onAfterGetCur record, the C-side compiler was fine with you having a function that had the same name as a trigger, but AL doesn't like that. So AL will just simply break if you have a procedure that has the same name as a trigger. It just doesn't understand that. And this is just this takes a couple of iterations, especially if you have code that is 1 or 2 decades old, like this one. You will most definitely run into cases like this, where code runs fine, and you have to rewrite some of that code. Local variables, this is a function that we had added to the sales header, and after conversion we run into the problem that the sales header is a global variable, and you cannot reference a global variable from a table extension. So you have to work around that. And in this case, the workaround was to use the get header function, which returns the sales header. And this was also a fix that we could do in C-side. We fixed it in C-side. And after the fix, we reconverted, and the reconverted code compiled just fine in AL. Then we have the big enum story. We all know that it's very hard to add option types to base NAV. And we had added types to the purchase and sales line. We added the types proceed and cost. But we decided to replace them with service items. When we created the solution 20 years ago, service items did not exist. And we analyzed why we had added proceeds and costs, and we decided that service items do exactly what we need. So why would we add a type to the sales and purchase line when we can just replace that with service items? And this is again a fix that you can do in C-side. And maybe you have an add-on solution that you created 10 years ago, and 10 years ago you made a decision, but maybe that decision is not valid anymore. Maybe with the current code base, you can make a different decision, and by making that different decision, your code actually converts into an extension. And even in most cases, my opinion is that if your code converts into an extension without errors, the code in C-side will also be cleaner and easier to maintain. And it worked, right? So we have our solution in Business Central, and we can now start thinking about breaking down the solution into multiple extensions and how to do data conversion and all of that. So our roadmap is to go hybrid. We are currently hybrid. We have parts of our code in extensions, and we keep some of the core in C-side. Also, because of our licensing issue, we cannot move until we go to the real cloud where objects are free. We are starting to move away from .NET. We started to use Azure functions and Blob storage. And I think it's really cool to do another webinar on that. I don't have time to go into details. Azure Blob storage is amazing. It's super fast and very easy to work with. And I really wish that I moved to Azure Blob storage a long time ago compared to dealing with file shares. We also implemented client add-ins using Angular and Azure. And I briefly want to show you a couple of screenshots of prototypes that we have been working on. These prototypes have had over 2,000 man-hours of work with. So before you get enthusiastic about the screenshots that I'm just going to show you, building your own UI in Angular, making it reliable and making it fast is a tough cookie. It's very easy, very hard to work with. This is one of our screens. This is where we have our shipments, and this page does not convert into the web client. It looks extremely ugly. It has 80 columns, and it's very hard to work with in the web client. I talked about it with Microsoft, and they said it's not a priority for us. This will not work anytime soon. This is another page where I think we pulled every trick in the book to make the page look nice in the role-tailored client. We generate bitmaps at runtime, and we have a header page with a list page, and I think we can all agree that this is not going to fly in the web client. It has 50 columns in each page, and it has over 100 columns, and it will just slowly fade away. And on top of that, we use links with Google Maps that we wanted to have as embedded into NAV for a long time. So this is what we came up with. This is built in Angular. It has pyjama printing, so every odd row is gray, which makes it a lot easier to work with. Everything is HTML5 formatted. So with HTML5, you can add background colors, foreground colors. You can change the font. You can make it blink. You can have icons. And on top of that, we decided to have concatenated columns. So where in previous, in the standard NAV layout, we had to have a column for each row in the database, we now have concatenated columns, and we can actually display multiple columns in one row, but we can still filter on the individual columns. And this works both in the Windows client and in the web client. And we used extensions for this. We used extensions with the new JavaScript options. And the JavaScript is hosted in Azure, which is really nice. It's exactly what we did with the ForNAV solution as well. The code is hosted in Azure, which means that if you want to make a change, you can make the change in the Azure environment, and the NAV extension will automatically pick it up. And this is perfect if you want to go to AppSource, because in AppSource, if you want to change your business logic, you have to go through Microsoft to have your AL code submitted to AppSource. But if you host your own code in an Azure function and you refresh your own code and part of your IP is living in Azure, you can change that behavior without having to go through Microsoft and without having to go to every individual customer to go and update their extension. I think we are running out of time, so I'm going to switch. This is our map, which is created using leaflet maps. Very cool. Breaking up your extension. If you convert your solution, in our case, we ended up with an extension that had 2,000 objects. This is not easy to maintain, so we decided to start breaking up our extension. Of course, our extension has a dependency on Anveo and ForNAV. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about the demo. Then we have our core, which is our base transport management system. But then we have subsystems like EDI, board computer interface, management information, warehouse document, and all of that, those things. And those things will be individual extensions, which is nice because we have an EDI guy. And that EDI guy can now start working in his own extension. And we have a guy doing management information who can now work in his own extension. So people are not working all in the same Seaside solution anymore, which is actually also very nice. And on top of that, we also have automated tests and the Angular project. The other case I wanted to talk about is getting your ISV solution to AppSource. And if the customer case was far left, where it's a one-off project, it's highly customized, it's for this customer only, and nobody shares the code, this is the extreme right. And here we have hundreds of customers using exactly the same code base. And we have customers on NAV 2013, 15, 16, 17, 18, Business Central on-prem, Business Central with extensions, AppSource. And we want to keep everyone on the same code base, and we only want to make every code change once, right? So the development process for that looks a little bit different than the customized customer project. We develop everything in Seaside still. Everything is developed in Seaside in Business Central. The reason why we chose Business Central Seaside is because in Business Central Seaside, we have a couple of events that we want to subscribe to that are not available in older versions, like replacing reports with other reports, which, as you can imagine, for us, is a very important event. And from Seaside, we actually go and create our Seaside version for Business Central. And then we have some regular expressions that Jacob created, which downgrades the solution to NAV 2018, 17, 16, 15, and 2013. And with the downgrade, you must think like in our add-on, we have notifications, and older versions don't have notifications. So Jacob throws away the notification code unit if we downgrade before 2017. We also subscribe to a couple of events, and we have a couple of features that are only in Business Central, And if we downgrade to 2015, Jacob throws away those event subscribers. And we just document that if you want to use those features, you have to upgrade to newer versions. But other than that, the add-on works exactly the same in every version. Then we have the Business Central on-premise story, where we create a runtime package and we allow people to have that runtime package and to publish that as an extension on-premise. And then we have the AppSource story. We convert the code to AppSource, and this is where we also automatically convert from .NET to Azure. Michael and Jacob created Azure service function, which replaces our .NET. And in the conversion process, we actually convert all of our .NET to an Azure API. On top of that, we have to add some stuff, because in C-side, there is no concept like an install code unit. Install code units are only for extensions. In C-side, there is no concept like permissions, XML. You have to create your XML file with permissions and add that. And we also have the translation story that I'll briefly touch upon later. The result is that we are on AppSource. We were added, I think, about a week ago during my vacation. And I can very proudly say that we automatically convert from C-side, and we give Microsoft our converted C-side code, and we were approved to AppSource without any technical rejection from Microsoft. So approved in one go. So it is possible to do that if your code is clean and if you spend some, if you do some disciplined cleaning up in your C-side. So let's look at the conversion process. The conversion process, as I said before, is a mix between PowerShell and MS-DOS. First, you have to run MS-DOS to run finsql.exe with the command export to new syntax. You have to give it the database, the server name, a log file, a filter, and an export file. The filter is very important because you don't want to export every object to your extension. What I use pretty often is that I actually abuse the locked field. So in C-side, you have the locked flag, and what I abuse a lot is that I lock the files that I want to convert to an extension, and then I filter on locked equals yes, and then I export all of my locked files to an extension. That also allows you to exclude the files that you don't have in your license, because those will not be locked. Then you have to use the PowerShell to create your Delta files, and you can convert those Delta files also to your extension. And then you have to use the txt to AL executable to convert your CAL code to AL code. And then my recommendation is to add the rename flag, because that will create nice names for your objects. And lastly, you have to run this menu suite PowerShell thing, and you want to, if you want to add the searchability to your pages and reports. So let's quickly do a demo. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, other than quickly show you the process. There are YouTube videos on this. There are YouTube videos on the standard Microsoft tools. And if you go to the ForNAV YouTube channel, there's also a YouTube video there that shows you the conversion process using the ForNAV tools. And I have a confession to make. I prepared for this webinar last Monday, and I could not get the Delta files to convert. And I think it's a bug in Cumulative Update 3 for Business Central. But I could not get the Delta files to create. It kept erroring out on line numbers that were added to my export. So what did I do? Let's first look at the solution, which is in NAV 2018. This is our test environment, which is on NAV 2018. If you want to convert this to an extension, The first step that you have to do is that you have to export all of your objects to a FOB file. And what I did is I copied that FOB file to my local system. And on my local system, I have created a new database. So I just created a new database. And then I have created a database that I called Webinar Base and Webinar AL. And in this database, I simply import the FOB file. And if you import the FOB file, you have to explicitly say that you only want to import new objects. Because in Business Central, some of the objects moved to these new system code units. And if you import the system tables, it will explode. It will not work. And also what I did, if I import the FOB file, I set the data, the schema synchronization to later. If you set the schema synchronization to later, you don't need to have a service tier for this database. And after importing, you simply export the objects to the new syntax. I'm doing that using this batch file. I have my export batch file, which all reminds us when we were kids, when we created autoexec.bat and stuff like that. And here we have the finsql.exe with the command export to new syntax. The log file is very important because the log file will give you errors like you have an object outside of your license, or well, that's typically the error that I get. The error that I get is I have an object outside of my license, and I should not quite do that with my database. And after doing that, you can create the Delta files in which I failed miserably. And after you've done that, you can actually run the conversion process. And here you run the txt to AL with your source and your target. With our ForNAV solution, it's a little bit easier because our ForNAV solution is already living inside of Business Central. So here I just have to search for my objects, and they are already in the correct version. And if for whatever strange reason I wanted to convert these objects without the ForNAV converter, I could simply export them directly from Business Central. The process of doing the same with the ForNAV converter, in my opinion, is a little bit easier. First of all, the ForNAV converter has a user interface. And I'm a little bit of an old-fashioned guy. I like to have a user interface. And in this user interface, I can simply point to the files that I want to use. The first file that I want to use is my app file. And the app file contains the metadata that we need to convert the code. And in this case, you can see that I have pointed to *app in a folder called Anveo AL packages. And the reason I do that is that this folder actually contains 3 app packages: Microsoft System, Microsoft Application, and Anveo. And this is necessary because my objects take a dependency on all 3 of these app files. And by putting those 3 app files in my metadata, it knows what to create in my AL. Then I need my import file, and my input file can be exported directly from Seaside. So in my NAV 2018, I can just say file, export to a text file, and I don't have to run this ms-dos command of running of creating the new syntax, and I don't have to update my customers' databases to a new version. Then I have my output file, which is also a bit ambiguous. It's not really a file. It's just a folder, and this folder will contain my AL files that I want to create. I have to say that I want to create either on-prem or cloud version. If I want to go to cloud, it will convert the .NET to Azure. It will not convert your .NET to Azure, right? That's still manual task. It will only convert ForNAV .NET to Azure. It's not that nice. I split my output to one file per object. If you don't do that, you will just get one file with all of your AL code. And you probably don't want that. And I have my application baseline objects that we use for the conversion process that I export from my Cronus database. After I have done that, I have a project. This is the project that we use for ForNAV. Here we have our report pack, and the report pack has all the converted AL files. All of these AL files convert without any error, and I simply add our install code unit, which I stole from Gunnar, from his GitHub repository, and I have my extension permission set. And this we package and we send to Microsoft, and they publish it for us on AppSource. The other project is a little bit more complicated, and it does not yet compile, but this is our other solution. This contains currently about 2,000 files, and this currently has 400 errors. One of the nice things that I think we have in the ForNAV converter is that we actually create a code unit for the Delta file. So this is my code unit Delta file. And here I get a list of all my code modifications. And all of these code modifications, I have to search event subscribers for. So this is a to-do list. This gives me a to-do list of stuff that I have to do for code unit 12. This is code unit 80. This is an object modification to code unit 80. So for this modification, I have to find an event subscriber. And for this code modification, I have to find an event subscriber, right? So we use the Delta file, and we give the Delta file to you as a shopping list to start finding event subscribers. We also add the searchability to the page. So your page gets a usage category, your page gets an application area. We do stuff like in tables. If you have a table extension, we throw away the keys. Unfortunately, it's not possible to create keys on Microsoft objects. And if you want to see all the features that we have in the ForNAV converter, just go to our website or to the YouTube channel. I can talk about this all day, but we are already running out of time, unfortunately. Jan, how are we on questions? Can you tell me how we are on questions?
Not bad. We only have less than 5, I think. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. And people are not leaving by any chance?
No. They are still here.
Okay.
They are still here. We
Okay,
promised
good.
a goodie at the end. No. Do you want to take questions now, or do you want to go on?
No, I want to go on. If we only have 5, then we can go on. But people should start thinking about their questions if they have any. Yeah. And if questions all of a sudden start popping in, I'll stop and then we'll start addressing those questions.
Yeah, cool.
So the ForNAV converter has a user interface. It also has a PowerShell commandlet, and it works on any C-side version as long as you have pages. It creates the page and table extensions without having to do the PowerShell stuff. It converts the code unit Delta files, as I just showed you. If you have event subscribers to code unit 1, we will map them to the new code units automatically. And we also rename some controls, like Microsoft creates control 1,000,018, and we convert that 1,000,018 to a name. We have the deduplication of the .NET. Let me show you what I mean with that. Here, it's here we have the .NET somewhere. The .NET.al file. If you have a .NET in here that Microsoft is already using, you don't have to explicitly declare it again. So if Microsoft is already declaring system.net.http web request, you don't have to declare it again. If I decomment out this line of code, it will actually tell me, once the compiler wakes up, that this type has already been declared and I should not declare it again, right? That's basically what it's saying. And it means that in the base application, this is already declared. So what Michael did, he's a very smart guy, is that he actually figures out what .NET types Microsoft is using, and he's not using those again. This is also a bit dangerous for duplicate names. Here I have in my board computer interface, I have a API that points to a document, but Microsoft is using document for Word. So here I have to go back to my C side and I have to make this into something unique, right? This is where you have to go back to C side and fix it, because you will never be able to fix this in your extension. Application areas are populated, menu suites are converted, and keys are commented out because we cannot add keys to standard Navision tables. You have to use the Azure optimizer to create keys at runtime. I showed you this. This is the UI from the conversion tool. It's free of charge, right? This is something that we needed it for ourselves. We wanted to convert C-side to AL. And because we needed it ourselves, we decided, shall we give this away to the community? Of course, we will give this away to the community. And it's your choice if you want to stick to Microsoft. Actually, what Michael is doing behind the scenes, we are using the Microsoft DLL. So we are using the Microsoft DLL. And if Microsoft makes improvements to the DLL, we get those improvements for free as well. The main change that Michael did is the export to new syntax and all of the goodies of handling the code after it's generated, like the menu suite. We also have the Modern Object Explorer that I think is very useful if you want to keep track of object changes. I use the Modern Object Designer to keep track of which objects I have already used in multiple extensions. It's kind of an Excel sheet, and it also allows you to run extension objects from the Windows client. It's also available as an extension, but that's a little bit scary, because if you run the ForNAV Object Designer as an extension, you can actually run any NAV code unit in the web client, and not all of the code units are intended to be run in the web client. Some actually completely blow up your tenant if you're not careful. So we tested this on ForNAV. We tested, yeah.
No,
yeah.
We are getting more questions now. So if you could wrap up in 2-3 minutes, it would be nice, Mark.
Yeah, I will wrap up. So these are the partners that helped us testing. We used Verito, Anveo, and the Learning Network, and my programming book as a test case. Translations. Keep translations as far away from your code as possible. If you want to improve the performance of Visual Studio, disable the code lens. That makes it faster. Data conversion. If you want to do data conversion, you have to use T-SQL. You have to create your own T-SQL statements. And if you want to migrate from on-prem to the cloud, you have to use the intelligent cloud solution. Let's skip this slide. We already talked about the license. A FOP is not an app. Be careful with runtime packages, because runtime packages are not debuggable. I really hope Microsoft will find a fix for that. We talked about .NET, publish code. Yeah, that's key takeaways. Start thinking about your solutions today, because conversion will take months, if not more than a year. And please don't look at this as a developer's task. Don't go to your developer and say, guy, girl, can you please convert a solution and get out of your basement when you're ready. This is a team effort, and you gotta make business decisions for doing this. I don't care if you want to use Microsoft or the ForNAV tool, that's your decision. And don't forget that C-side will retire probably sooner than you think or hope. So Jan, the floor is yours for questions.
Okay, so when upgrading from old versions of NAV, is it a good idea to upgrade objects to NAV 2018 and then convert to AL?
Yeah, so if you want to use the Microsoft tools, then that's mandatory. It's mandatory to do that first. If you just want to, if you have a 2017 database and you just want to see the quality of your extension, you can export all of the objects from Seaside in NAV 2017, run them through the ForNAV Converter, and just look at the errors. And from that perspective, I think the ForNAV Converter is a great tool for quotes. If you just want to make a quote for your customer and your customer wants to say, customer tells you, hey, partner, can you give me an idea of the complexity of this upgrade? You don't have to go through that path. You may eventually still want to do hybrid because of a roadmap, but that's not technically necessary to get an idea.
Okay, then there's one specific to the FOSS case, whether you created one extension for all tables or more extensions.
Yeah, so we decided to group our functionality into micro solutions. So we currently have about 5 extensions running, and I expect that we will end up with about 12. And given that we have about 2,000 objects, I think a ratio of 1 extension per like 100 or 200 objects is a fair level of complexity. You don't want to make your extensions too small. That'll make it really hard to maintain. But you don't want to make them too big because you don't have Seaside anymore, and you can't hack away into one extension with too many developers.
Okay. What are Delta files?
The root question to that answer is, where have you been in the last 5 years? That's the root answer. I'm sorry about that. Delta files are the old version of table extensions and page extension. But just use Google and you'll find the answer.
Okay. Can you use .NET without Azure functions?
On-premise, yes. On-premise, you can still use .NET. In the cloud, yes and no. If you have a very simple .NET requirement, and you think that your .NET requirement is generic enough, you can request Microsoft to create a wrapper code unit for your .NET in base Seaside, so everybody can use it. And some partners have been successful in having .NET added to Seaside wrappers. Especially Gunnar has a good connection for that. But the general approach is to convert it into Azure functions, which honestly is a task that you can easily outsource because it's a one-to-one mapping.
Okay. Is it possible to use suffix or prefix for AL in ForNAV Converter?
That's a good question, and I think Michael has to answer that. Right now, no, but it should be fairly easy to add. Michael?
Yeah, we heard the question from some people, and we're looking at adding that to Converter. Also, the converter converts BC. Also, the new properties that you have got in there. There's some new properties in the Spring release, and if you ask us at support@fornav.com, we'll send you a release that also supports the Spring release.
Okay. So the answer is no, but it will be there soon.
Exactly.
By the way, we have prefixed. This is one of these things that you can also do in Seaside. So in Seaside, we already prefixed our stuff, right? So maybe the right answer to this question is go back to Seaside and prefix in Seaside.
Yeah.
Because that will enable you to keep one code base,
so
like we did. Yeah.
Just one comment on the one-to-one conversion of .NET to Azure functions. So in most cases, you cannot do that because beyond getting the same functionality, you also run into latency issues, thunking issues, and a lot of other issues that Azure functions is simply not suitable for. So just a warning here, it's not simple. It's a lot of hard work, and you can get really burned if you just think you can do it one-to-one.
Yeah, I have one slide where I have some suggestions for other webinars. if you guys really like us sharing all of the stuff that we learned in the last year, we can also do a webinar about Azure functions, or Michael and Jakob can maybe share what they learned there, if there is a requirement for that.
Yeah, there are a few questions about additional webinars, but we can take them afterwards.
Yeah, we are on top of the hour, so I don't know if you have any.
Yeah. Well, I have some, but I think we should look into whether we should do an FAQ on some of this, because some of them I think are more than just yes or no questions.
Okay. I think that's I think that's good. I think we should we can convert all these questions to an Excel sheet, and let's analyze all the questions. Yeah. And don't be disappointed if your questions was not answered. We will definitely get back to them, but we are on top of the hour and we want to respect everybody's time.
Exactly.
So thanks, right? Thank you for attending, and looking forward to seeing you again on one of our next webinars.
And thank you, Mark, for doing this.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.